Hello everybody, I'm Benjamin Anthony, co-founder and CEO of the MiriamInstitute.org, and I want to thank you for joining us here at JBS TV for this exclusive episode of the Miriam Institute debate series, in which we ask the question, which presidential ticket is best for the Israel-US relationship? On either side of that debate, we drew together a panel of two expert panelists, one Israeli and one American. In favor of Biden-Harris, we were joined by Aaron David Miller, a former State Department Middle East negotiator and analyst, and he was accompanied by Professor Chuck Freilich, formerly a Deputy National Security Advisor for the State of Israel and now a professor at Columbia University in New York and Tel Aviv University in Israel. In favor of Trump-Pence, we had the privilege of hosting Ambassador Danny Ayalon, Israel's former ambassador to the United States of America, and he was joined by Josh Hammer, opinion editor at Newsweek and syndicated columnist. It made for a fascinating debate, with a live audience vote taken at the outset and the conclusion of the argumentation, and that vote yielded a result that was wholly unpredictable and unforeseen. I hope you enjoy the debate, and I want to thank JBS TV for hosting this episode of the debate series once again. Be sure to follow their work, and I'd like to encourage all of you to invest in the vital undertakings and mission of jbstv.org. Now, on with the debate. Okay, good evening to everybody here. It's a real pleasure to begin this evening's debate. Speaking in favor of the Trump-Pence ticket, Ambassador Danny Ayalon, Israel's former ambassador to the United States of America. Ambassador, before you begin, I'd like to ask you to do something a little bit odd. Tell us something about yourself that will certainly endear you to opponents of your position.
So let me say something that, hopefully will endear me by everybody, because I want to say that I had the privilege to meet Joe Biden many times when he was a senior member of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, and I was in Washington. We've had many great meetings in my home, the ambassador's home, in his office, in some other social engagements. And I not only like him personally, I also appreciate the fact that he is a great supporter of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. I have always remembered, and I still do, that he calls himself a Zionist. And again, I know we are in a very heated season now. Emotions are running high. Polarization is also abound, both in my country and in the United States. But we will have to hopefully look beyond that and look at things objectively. I also am of the opinion that the bipartisan support of the United States to Israel is very important. And I have always maintained that no matter who occupies the Oval Office in the White House, the relations will always go forward, will always be strong, because the alliance between our two countries is a natural one. So these are my initial remarks as to endearing myself, and then I can go on. Benjamin.
Thank you, Ambassador. Please continue. Your 7 minutes starts now.
Okay. So I also appreciate the fact that the scope of the debate is also very focused. We're talking about the relationship. We're not talking about personalities. And this is something which is very important for all of us to remember. And I maintain that for the relationship, the Israel-US relationship, which are probably the most important relationship for the state of Israel, critically, in terms of our survival, our future, our security. And I also believe they're very important also to the United States. This relationship or relations are a two-state, two-way street. And as I mentioned, I would like to maintain that the Trump-Pence ticket would be better for the relationship simply because they have been tested. And for the last 4 years, the relationship were at all-time high. And how do you measure that? You measure it by results. You measure it by policy. You measure it by the trust and confidence between the two countries, especially between its leaders. And the policy of Trump-Pence, when they started their administration, was very clear. No daylight between Israel and the United States. This is something which is very important in terms of Israel's security and deterrence to any foe that may be tempted to attack it. It's also very important for Israel for its status in the international arena. You know that we have unfortunately been a fair game at the UN, the Human Rights Council, UNESCO, any other UN agency because of the Arab automatic majority. And when the United States stands firm and has Israel back, then the attacks on Israel are quite tamed. For the last 4 years, there were no condemnations or any resolutions against Israel in the Security Council because the United States was on guard. Also, the number of anti-Israeli resolutions in all other international agencies were quite, markedly down. And this is also because the U.S. No-tolerant policy towards anti-Israeli bias and unfair accusations of Israel on many things. So when this is the case, then we can really stand high and tall, and our position in the international arena has been much better than it was 4 years before. Also, on a regional basis, when the U.S.-Israel relationship has no daylight policy, then Israel is a country which is very much coveted by, I would say, friends and foes alike. And the results here in the region is regional alliances that Israel has been participating in the last 4 years, which did not exist before. We can start with the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, with Greece and with Cyprus, which is also very strategic. We can look at down south with Egypt vis-a-vis Hamas. And of course, we see now in the Gulf that many countries are joining in peace and normalization with Israel. And then if we come to Iran, which is a main threat, not just to the United States, but also to Israel and the region. And it's quite amazing to see that all enemies of the United States, almost by definition, are also enemies of Israel and vice versa. So with maximum pressure on Iran, we also see Iran more tamed. They stopped the ballistics testing, even though it was not in the JCPOA from 2015. Deterrence was achieved by also killing Qasem Soleimani, which was the arch terrorist in the region, actually unstabling all countries around here, whether it was Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and Libya and Sudan, and certainly trying to do it to Israel through Hezbollah in the north and Hamas in the south. So this was much tamer. Also, I believe that getting out of the agreement with Iran from 2015 allowed us to be much bolder in our defense in the north, and we have not heard any reservations from the United States. When we had for self-defense to attack the Iranians, we're trying to entrench in Syria, we got backing, full backing from the United States, from this administration, whether it was in Iraq or Lebanon, anywhere that we needed to act, including Hamas. And I don't think, and I have followed many administrations, there was no administration that for 4 years did not have any complaints or any daylights between them and Israel. So also today, as part of this strong relationship and supporting the relationship, we see an alliance also of the Sunni moderate countries against the Shiite Ayatollahs in Iran, which is better for the relationship because it's best for Israel and it's best for the United States. And then we have, of course, the Palestinians. And we have seen a paradigm shift, which was quite bold by the Trump-Pence administration, where they decided no more we give the Palestinians a veto power over what's happening in the Middle East because of their intransigence, because of their refusal to step up to the table. We can no longer keep the entire region paralyzed and backward. The Palestinians, unfortunately, and we have seen it in the last
Ambassador Ayalon, that concludes your time. Thank you very much indeed.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That is your 7 minutes. Thank you very much indeed for your opening statement. And I'm delighted now to bring out Aaron David Miller, former State Department Middle East analyst and negotiator. Aaron David Miller, we look forward to learning from you. And as I asked of the ambassador, tell us something that will endear you and to the opponents of your position.
I will do that with great pleasure, Benjamin, in the presentation. So I'm going to start my 7 minutes now, if that's okay.
Wonderful.
It's an honor to be here and to have the opportunity to argue for the motion why Biden-Harris would be better for the U.S.-Israeli relationship than 4 more years of Donald Trump. Chuck and I can speak for Chuck, I think, are honored to take part in this debate with our very worthy opponents. Danny Ayalon, with whom I've been acquainted for years, a great admirer, and Josh Hammer, who I've met recently. Let me begin with an assertion that may surprise anyone who believes that the Biden-Netanyahu relationship will somehow be a honeymoon ought to lay down, wait quietly until the feeling passes. This observation flows from 20 plus years of working with the U.S.-Israeli relationship under different administrations, Republican and Democrat, and understanding that because of different histories and geographies, there will be differences between Israel and the United States. And to expect a solid coincidence of interests across the board is illogical. In many respects, Israel is Mars and the United States is Venus. We have non-predatory neighbors to our north and south, the Canadians and the Mexicans. We have fish to our east and west, what one historian, I wish it had been me, described as our liquid assets. These two oceans put us in an unparalleled, unprecedented situation where our security is not at risk. Israel is living on top of a volcano. I've had 2 Israeli prime ministers, Rabin and Netanyahu, using the exact same words, tell me the following: you live in Chevy Chase, Maryland. Don't preach to us about our security. We're living on top of a volcano. And I don't. And that's a reality that needs to be understood by everyone. At the same time, it strains credibility to the breaking point to believe that Trump administration policies over the last 4 years have not heavily spent currency that is critical to the health and well-being of the U.S.-Israel relationship, or that Joe Biden is somehow an adversary or enemy of Israel, ready to pounce by pressuring Jerusalem on Iran and the Palestinians should he become president. The damage Mr. Trump has done to the relationship, to America, to the Jewish community, are potentially strategic wounds that, if we're honest and think broadly, tarnishes and undermines much of Trump's record. The headlines look rosy, but I hope to persuade you, and Chuck will as well, that the trend lines are quite worrisome. Our argument for Biden over Trump rests on 4 pillars. I'll lay out the first 3, and Chuck will conclude with a critical 4th. Number 1, Trump is making America weak again. Meeting for the first time in 1961, President Kennedy asked David Ben-Gurion what he could do for Israel. Kennedy asked Ben-Gurion, and the response from Ben-Gurion was, "Mr. President, be a good president for the United States. Trump's been anything but. Sheer incompetency, venality, fecklessness, and negligence. It drags the United States' reputation and credibility down, raising serious questions about whether America has the capacity or credibility to lead. Israel's interests are best served and best protected when the U.S. is strong militarily and economically, respected and admired abroad, and reflecting our values. Unlike Trump, who has weakened America abroad and made it something of a laughingstock at home, Biden will restore competency, predictability, and logic to the U.S. foreign policy. And in doing so, a stronger Israel is going to mean, stronger America is going to mean a stronger Israel. Number two, Trump is killing bipartisanship. The course we are on now under Trump, making the GOP the go-to party on Israel and demonizing the Democrats, is likely to produce the worst of both worlds. 2 or 3 Democratic views of Israel and 1 Republican view. If and when that happens, the special relationship between Israel and the United States is going to erode. The durability of our relationship rests on shared values and a kind of bipartisanship which allows mainstream Democrats and Republicans to support Israel because it's in the broadest conception of our national interest. Mr. Trump, in my judgment, and I've worked for Republicans and Democrats and voted for them, has no conception of what an American national interest or bipartisan interest really are. Look at how he embarrassed the Prime Minister of Israel during the Sudan announcement by basically saying to him, asking him, quote, "Sleepy Joe couldn't have done it, don't you think?" Or his comment that Jews are somehow disloyal if they don't understand that the Democratic view and support for Israel is much weaker than the Republican. This notion of killing bipartisanship is critically important to, it's going to guarantee more polarization at home on an Israel issue that should be uniting most Americans. Finally, point 3, Trump is dividing America, courting white nationalists, and enabling anti-Semites. Just listen to former ADL President Abe Foxman. Trump has, quote, given succor to bigots, supremacists, and those seeking to divide our society. He and his administration dehumanize immigrants, demonize the most vulnerable, and undermine the civility and enlightened political culture that have allowed Jews to achieve what no diaspora community outside Israel can claim in 2 millennia. Bret Stephens today in the New York Times essentially said the same thing. The Trumpian right's obsession with border walls, tariffs, and cuts to illegal immigration is a vehicle for a toxic brand of American nationalism that over time cannot bode well for American Jews. Anti-Semitic incidents are up 12%, according to the ADL. And finally, just let me conclude. It's not that Mr. Trump is responsible for it. We should not be surprised that anti-Semitism has been normalized in an environment where intolerance of all types has flourished. And finally, as an American, as a human being, and as a Jew, I'm deeply troubled by all of this, and you should be too. The U.S.-Israeli relationship is a precious commodity, too important to be left in the hands of a man who has used it largely as a vehicle to...
Thank you, Aaron David Miller. That concludes your time at the microphone. Thank you so very much. We are now going to call upon our next debater. That debater is Mr. Josh Hammer. He is a syndicated columnist and opinion editor at Newsweek. Josh Hammer, I'm delighted to invite you to present your argument. Please let us know of just one thing before you do that endears you and to opponents of your position.
Sure. So, Benjamin, it's so great to be with you. Just for the audience, Benjamin and I got to know one another a little bit in my final year of law school when he was heading up his predecessor organization, Our Soldiers Speak. And I've always thought so highly of you, not just for your wonderful English accent, of course, but due to your kind of innovative policy chops and your just unquenching, unyielding Zionism, which I, of course, robustly share. So it's a real honor to be with you, to be here with Miriam Institute. What an honor and a privilege, of course, to be alongside Ambassador Ayalon. I am frankly not worthy of that honor. I hope to make it up for you and what I have to say here tonight. And of course, we have two very esteemed gentlemen on the other side of this resolution as well. Professor Freilich, who I've not met before, but it's wonderful to meet you. And Dr. Miller, who I've worked with on at least one, I can't remember if it's more than one op-ed since I took over as Newsweek opinion editor, but obviously a big fan of your decades of experience and work as well. Benjamin, as far as a quick note before I'll start my timer as to what could endear me here, I'll take a very personal, non-substantive way to answer that question. I have a really cute sheepadoodle dog who's currently locked in a crate upstairs just so that he doesn't bark and ruin my Zoom experience. I love him dearly. And he's a wonderful puppy. And he's very cute, and I wish I could share photos. So I hope that humanizes me before I start. So on that note, happy to begin, of course. So I have to admit, I'm a little baffled that we're even debating this resolution tonight. You know, I've been very frustrated with my American co-religionists, my fellow American Jews for many, many years now. And I make no bones about it. I'm a full spectrum conservative. I believe in the vision of this administration. I believe in conservative political philosophy across the board. But it seems to me that my co-religionists might perhaps want to vote for Biden-Harris on many issues with which I might disagree with them, perhaps on the legal protection that ought to be codified under our rule of law to unborn life in the womb. Perhaps they might disagree with me as to whether we should build a border wall. Perhaps they might disagree with me as to the scope and extent of the individual right to keep and bear arms under the Second Amendment to the Constitution. But I am utterly baffled as to how any of my co-religionists could possibly disagree with the very straightforward resolution, the very straightforward notion that Donald J. Trump is the most philo-Semitic pro-Israel president, arguably ever, at least since my hero of all heroes in American political history, Abraham Lincoln, who was intimately familiar with scripture, famously referred to America as a, quote, almost chosen people. At least since that, I would argue perhaps as far back as George Washington himself, who, of course, in 1790 wrote his very famous letter to the Newport, Rhode Island Jewish congregation, assuring the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island that the, quote, children of the stock of Abraham shall forever sit under their own vine and fig tree and shall never be afraid. Donald Trump, through deed and word, has been the most loyal friend of the Jewish people. He's been the most loyal and trustworthy ally and nurturer and caretaker of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And he has, to an extent, I think, completely thrown out the window 6 to 7 decades of bromides, outmoded orthodoxies, the failures of the bipartisan neoliberal consensus, the failures of the two-state solution cartel that has run Washington, D.C. think tank world, academia, political world into the ground with this naive, fanciful, outrageous nation-building democratization project idea that the quote-unquote inside-out approach to Israeli-Palestinian peace, where Israel has to capitulate to appease the PLO, which was founded to annihilate the Jews, throw them into the river, that is the way to achieve durable, lasting peace, security, and stability in the region that was imbibed like mother's milk by administrations of both parties, of course. We can go all the way back, of course, to post-Nixon, of course, Carter, Reagan, obviously Rabin and Clinton and in the Oslo Accords in 94. What Trump did is he threw this entire paradigm out the window. He showed that the outside-in approach can work. And what he has done, I understand we are not debating who's been the best for Israel. I do feel obliged to note the fact that a recent Jerusalem Post poll shows that Israeli Jews prefer Donald Trump over Joe Biden by a 45-point margin, 63 to 18%. So the chutzpah, the arrogance of anyone who might deign to tell Israeli Jews that they have it wrong and that Biden is a preferred candidate is just, I think, intrinsically an outrageous misunderstanding. But beyond that, what Trump and Pence have done in their 4 years in office is they have completely eviscerated and thrown the old paradigm out the window. They have obviously, by bolstering Israel, by emboldening Israel, by allowing Israel to take military action with respect to Iranian shipments into Hezbollah overrun Lebanon, into Bashar al-Assad Syria, by emboldening Israel and allowing them to take whatever action they need be with respect to Hamas overrun jihadist Gaza, with respect to taking care of whatever needs to be taken care of with respect to the uniquely evil Iranian regime. They have emboldened Israel, and in so doing, they have actually enhanced Israel's role in the region, as evidenced by the fact that over the past 2 months, we have seen 3 peace deals with the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan. And who knows what might come if we are blessed to have 4 more years of Donald J. Trump and Mike Pence. We might get Oman. We might get Morocco. We might get, obviously, the elephant in the room, of course, which is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But what's incredible to me is that, I wrote a column after the Trump vision, the plan for prosperity, was revealed back in January for the Jewish Journal of Los Angeles. The title of my column was entitled, "Saudi Arabia is more pro-Israel than the Democratic Party." That is true. That is a true statement. I stand by that today. And I stand by that today because there is not a Sunni Arab country in the Arab world that is not at this point sharing military data, intelligence sharing, that is not suffering from what people of my generation would say FOMO, fear of missing out on the UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan, trying to normalize relations with Israel. And what this is doing is it not just intrinsically beneficial for Israel, of course, but this axis, this Israel, Zionist, Arab, Sunni Arab axis, of course, with Egypt, the Saudis, Emiratis, and now the Sudanese, et cetera. What it's doing is that is helping American interests by combating pernicious Iranian hegemony in the region, of course, by checking the autocratic Erdogan regime in Turkey. By allowing Israel to be emboldened, we are actually directly helping U.S. security interests vis-a-vis Iran and Turkey, which are 2 of the largest American threats. But it's actually worse than that. Obviously, Joe Biden, I have no doubt that he's a self-proclaimed Zionist. He does not exactly have a particularly illustrative, nice history on this issue. I would like to remind the viewers that it was Joe Biden who in 1982, whose outrageous threat to withdraw military aid to Israel led then Prime Minister Menachem Begin to issue his most famous quote that he probably ever gave about how he is not a Jew on trembling knees and how he will not capitulate to this outrageous threat. And Joe Biden, by the way, Joe Biden opposed the May 2011 Obama administration strike to take out Osama bin Laden. Contrast that with Donald J. Trump's remarkable, courageous, bold, audacious, and absolutely manifestly correct strike to take out IRGC Quds Force head honcho Qasem Soleimani in January of this year. You have I don't even have words to describe that. I mean, how could you oppose taking out Osama bin Laden in Islamabad in 2011? So we're talking about installing that as commander-in-chief. But again, it's actually not even that bad. It's actually even worse than that. And why is it worse than that? Because, again, Joe Biden is nearing 80 years old by any reasonable stretch of someone who can view what we are looking. He is losing his mental faculties. He is borderline, if not fully senile at this point. And Kamala Harris will be a uniquely powerful vice president in this prospective Biden-Harris administration. According to numerous voting record indices that I have looked at, she had the single most liberal voting record of any senator in the year 2019, more so than even Bernie Sanders. And if you take that and you extrapolate it, what that will do is in allowing Kamala Harris to effectively run this administration, that's what it'll be. She will empower Linda Sarsour, Ilhan Omar, and all the on-campus
Josh,
SAP.
that brings your time to an end. Thank you very much indeed for your pressing the point on your side of the debate. And we appreciate now being able to move on to bring home the preliminary comments and statements. Professor Chuck Freilich, a former Deputy National Security Advisor for the State of Israel, and now a professor at Columbia University. Chuck, with your permission, given our friendship, I'm delighted to bring you to put your point across, and I'd invite you, please, to endear yourself and to opponents of your position before you do so.
Okay, well, first of all, professor at Columbia and Tel Aviv University. It's an important addition for me to note. First of all, thanks, Benjamin, and thanks, Rosita, for the invitation to join everyone tonight. Thank you to the Miriam Institute. And of course, it's a great pleasure to be here with my friends, Aaron and Dani, and a new colleague and friend, Josh. I can share, I think, just one, I hope, endearing story with you, which is that actually Dani and I live just a few hundred yards apart from each other. We normally meet each other, I'd say, about 3 times a week in the gym early in the morning. And I must say that Dani and his wife are really very, very serious and committed about this. I'm often envious of their commitment. Unfortunately, Corona has kept us apart for the last 3/4 of a year. I hope we can sweat near each other pretty soon once again. So let me start my 7 minutes now. And I'm going to start by saying, maybe I'll surprise some of our viewers. I'm not here to tell you that everything that Trump has done has been bad. It's not. He's done good things. And I'm not going to tell you that there won't be differences with Biden. There will be. On the two foremost issues of Israel's national security, Iran and peace with the Palestinians, President Trump has been a dramatic failure. And generally, Israel's national security is intimately linked to the national security of the United States. And when the United States is led by a man whose monumental incompetence for this job, his ineptitude, cannot be described in words, and who is the laughingstock of the world, then Israel's national security is severely impaired as well. But let me start with Iran. What does the president have to show on this number one issue? Well, he has failed to stop or even slow the nuclear program, just the opposite. Today, because he withdrew from the nuclear deal, an historic error, Iran is now 4 months away from enough fissile material for 2 bombs, compared to 12 months for 1 bomb when he took office. The result is that the US and Israel are less secure. He failed to achieve any changes in Iran's policy, at least good ones. Now, I'm for the sanctions and maximal pressure approach. I think that's right. But the objective was never to cause Iran pain, which is what it has done. It was to achieve results, to change Iran's policy. And the result here is zilch. As a matter of fact, Iran has learned to live with the sanctions. And actually, the result of the sanctions has been is that it has pushed Iran into the hands of China. And they are about to conclude, they're in the final stages of negotiations over a new $600 billion deal, both commercial and close military ties. Not exactly a victory from our point of view. The administration crashed and burned in its attempt to get an extension of the UN embargo on conventional arms sales to Iran. They have failed to stem Iran's regional expansionism. To the contrary, in recent months, President Trump has placed himself in the embarrassing position of just about begging the Iranians to reach a new deal. They're the ones who have not been willing to engage. And there is severe danger that in the second term, the president may fall in love with the supreme leader, much as he fell in love with the leader of North Korea, and simply sell out the store. Now, both candidates say that they want a new and better deal with Iran. Who would you trust to better negotiate it? The president has boxed himself in. We are now at the point where he may only have a military option left. He has no intention of using that. And the result is that many people in Israel are beginning to understand that when it comes to Iran, when it comes to the heavy lifting on Iran, Israel is actually on its own. And to make matters even worse, the Mideast is taking steps towards becoming a region with multiple nuclear powers, not just Iran. Turkey has shown interest, the Saudis, Egypt. This is a nightmare scenario. And what is the president doing? Everything he can to sell nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia. Now, on the peace process, both Dani and Josh correctly pointed out, yes, the president has done good things in terms of the regional peace process. The agreements with the UAE, with Bahrain, the partial agreement with Sudan, all good things. The reason that the UAE and Bahrain made this dramatic turnaround wasn't because they all of a sudden fell in love with Israel, but largely because they realized that they can no longer trust the United States as the guarantor of their security. And so they're turning to Israel. The counterpart to this is, of course, that the US has undertaken to sell them F-35s and all sorts of other advanced weapons, and Israel now faces a dramatic arms race. Yes, the embassy move, the Golan move were good things. On the other hand, these were major concessions or carrots for Israel that should have been saved for the context of a peace process, of negotiations with the Palestinians. Had the president ever really had a serious peace plan, which he didn't. The plan that was presented earlier this year is absurd. No one considers it a basis for negotiations. And the prospects for a two-state solution, I must say, may not survive another 4 years of this kind of inactivity or failure to achieve an agreement. Israel is rapidly becoming a binational state, and this is a tragedy in the making. If you look at the territory, Israel and the West Bank together, 40% of the population of this combined area is not Jewish. Now, I don't know any definition of a Jewish state in which 40% of the population is not Jewish. That's the situation that the president is trying to help us make permanent. We need a friend in the White House who understands the issues, who will help us make the difficult decisions, not someone who just talks. And the president talks tough, but in reality, what has he done? He's disengaged from the Mideast and allowed Putin to fill the vacuum. Russia is now the superpower in the Middle East, not the United States. Russia is selling weapons and nuclear reactors to anyone who will buy. Iran is setting up a forward base in Syria, and the US isn't playing. As a matter of fact, it abandoned the Kurds in Syria and allowed Turkey to step in. The president warned that if the Syrians used chemical weapons again, the US would strike. Well, there was one strike since then, repeated chemical attacks, nothing. Yes, there was the one-off against Soleimani. Nice. But what has happened since then? Repeated Iranian attacks on the American embassy in Baghdad, cyber attacks. Just before that, there was the huge attack on the Saudi oil infrastructure. Again, the president did one thing. That's it. That's not a policy. He abandoned the Kurds. What's going to happen in a second Trump term? This is a man who isn't beholden to anyone but himself. And I think his two number one objectives in the second term will be A, to avoid personal financial disaster, and secondly, to try and achieve a Nobel Prize. And how do you achieve a Nobel Prize in this case? Well, either through selling out, maybe, or at least trying to reach a deal too quickly with the Iranians, and maybe pushing Israel towards a deal with the Palestinians that it doesn't want. Now, contrary to what Josh said,
Herr Freilich, that concludes your time at the microphone. Thank you very much indeed. You've had your 7 minutes, and we're now going to move on to the next round of this debate. Each one of you has pressed your point with admirable force. We have brought on a series of moderators to pose questions to you from their unique perspectives, expertise, and experiences. I'd like to begin with the first question from moderator Frank Sobchak. Alan, please bring up Frank Sobchak to ask his first question.
Hi, thank you very much, Benjamin, for inviting me. My name is Colonel Frank Sobchak. I'm a retired Special Forces officer, co-editor of the official U.S. Army history of the Iraq War, and a PhD candidate at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I'm also a 2019 ILAP graduate, which was the best policy-oriented program I've ever attended due to its incredible access to key leaders of multiple political persuasions. So my question is for the Biden team, perhaps directly to Professor Freilich. My question is that I agree with you completely in terms of the fact that Iran, the decisions made under the Trump administration have progressed Iran towards obtaining a nuclear weapon unquestionably. That said, the JCPOA is viewed by most Israelis in extremely negative terms. At worst, that it provides a direct pathway for Iran to obtain that nuclear weapon, even worse than what Trump is doing. Or at best, the JCPOA would allow Iran to kind of obtain the bomb without limiting its expansion or its aggressive moves in Yemen, in Syria, and elsewhere. Biden is officially on the record to reinstate the JCPOA and use it as a starting off point to kind of move forward. Given that, and given kind of the Israeli opposition towards the JCPOA, what actions do you think that the Biden administration would take or should take towards the JCPOA that would both strengthen U.S.-Israel ties and improve regional security?
Thank you. And that question is to the Biden-Harris panel. Whomever wishes to take that. Is that Chuck? Do you want to lead with that? Thank you. And then I'm going to ask the other panel to respond to that. Thank you, Frank.
So first of all, Frank, thanks for a very good question and an appropriate question. But first of all, I want to disagree, or at least partly so, with your characterization that the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, for those who aren't familiar with the acronym, that it was viewed negatively in Israel. It was presented very negatively by the political leadership, and they are the political leadership. I don't in any way disagree with that. Most of the Israeli defense establishment, including the former chief of staff, who said it explicitly while he was in that position, but most of the defense establishment at the time and to this day actually believes that the JCPOA was the best of the bad options. Now, I don't think it was a perfect deal. No one thinks it was a perfect deal. The question is whether you live in La La Land, in some sort of place that you want to live in, or whether you live in reality, what you can achieve. I don't think that the Obama administration negotiated it perfectly. Maybe they could have gotten a slightly better deal, but that was the deal that they were able to negotiate. Now, it didn't provide a path leading for Iran to a bomb. It actually gave us 10 to 15 years of relative quiet in which we wouldn't have had to worry too much, assuming that Iran adhered. And of course, we would have to make sure that they did. And what should have been done is to take advantage of that 10 to 15 years. Israel's never achieved more than that on anything else that it's tried to do. We've always played for time. And then let's say in year 9, come to the Iranians and say, no, this thing never expires. Now, I said before, both Trump and Biden speak of reaching a new and better deal. I think just in terms of the skills required of a president, the mindset, there's no doubt that Biden is infinitely better suited to deal with this, to understand what has to be done, to set the direction for negotiators. And I think we have to make sure that when he talks about, as you said, reinstating the old deal as a basis for then going and negotiating the new one, that the important things are in the new deal. And substantively, I think there's actually broad agreement between Israel and the US on what should be there.
Well, it is true what my friend Chuck said, that some in the Israeli defense establishment were saying that this was the least of many evils, the JCPOA. But, and this is the main but, only if the Iranians truly adhere to all the specifics of the deal. And we know that this is a far cry from verification. First of all, every monitoring or inspection has to be approved by the Iranians 28 days before they come to inspect any site, which is giving them plenty time to hide and masquerade as they have been doing. Secondly, and more importantly, is that there were military sites excluded from the deal, meaning that the Iranians are free to do in these sites whatever they want. And thirdly, we know that the sunset clause could give the Iranian a free rein and break through a bomb whenever they wish. Also, there are two things which were missing in this agreement. And one is the ballistic missiles. And the third thing was the terror that they sponsor. And we know that after the JCPOA was signed, the ballistic testing of Iran was in a way peaking. And why was it peaking? You know, you only do ballistic testings to carry a nuclear payload. Otherwise, it's not worthwhile. So again, I would beg to say that going out of the JCPOA is the pressure that may persuade the Iranians maybe to come up to the deals. And they are waiting. You know, all we have to do is look at the Iranians. The Iranians pray every morning and 5 days a week, 5 times a day, that the Biden-Pence administration will come into existence. Why is that? Because they know that with the Biden-Harris, they can get a lot of slacks and they continue with their pernicious plan. Also,
thank you very much, Ambassador. Aaron David Miller, would you like to come back at this question at all?
All right, I think I'm unmuted. Look, the JCPOA was a flawed but functional arrangement designed to address a problem that neither Israel nor the United States had a comprehensive solution for. Nobody argued it was perfect. Tony Blinken, one of Biden's key advisors and likely someone who's going to have a significant position in a Biden administration should Joe Biden become president, talked about negotiating a new agreement that was longer and stronger. And I would argue to you that for a number of reasons, that is likely to be the position of the next administration. Maximum pressure is fine, except it is a set of tactics that doesn't seem to have a realistic sense of an end game. Is it designed to foment regime change, to create fractures within the regime so it'll be weaker? Is it designed to bring the Iranians back to the table on terms that will represent for them a capitulation? I don't know what the objective of maximum pressure is. I think it's a convenient slogan backed up by powerful leverage, and I think the United States now has it. So if the Biden administration wanted, with the acquiescence of the state of Israel, to negotiate a better agreement with Iran, I think that's the position that they're going to take. Joe Biden is going to be busy with so much with respect to economic recovery and COVID that the bandwidth for launching an ambitious effort to negotiate an agreement with Iran next year when Iran has presidential elections, I think the chances, frankly, of successful arrangement are slim to none.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to ask Josh Hammer to come in on that question with regard to the JCPOA.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Benjamin. I'll be quick, seeing as our time here tonight is limited. The JCPOA was a capitulation to fundamentalist evil, the likes of which the Western world has arguably not seen since Neville Chamberlain, coming back from his infamous talk with the Third Reich in the late 1930s. This is an Iranian regime that repeatedly threatens to commit a second Holocaust, that repeatedly threatens publicly, without Jack Dorsey deleting the Ayatollah's Twitter account, I might add, that repeatedly threatens publicly to wipe out the largest Jewish population in the world. This is a regime that, through the Obama-Biden administrations, clandestinely flying in overnight, unmarked tens or $100 million of cash, has been able to fund jihadism throughout the entire region. The Iran deal directly, the U.S. taxpayer via the Iran deal directly ended up funding Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Assad regime in Syria, helping to gas his own citizens, Hamas, Palestinian Islamist Jihad in Gaza. The Iranian regime's menace, their hegemony, their jihadism they foment throughout the region, of course, no one doubts this. But the U.S. taxpayer has directly subsidized that because of sanctions relief and the pallets of cash that have flown in. This is a uniquely evil regime, and I am baffled by this notion that the Iranian regime is doing anything other than being crippled right now. They have hyperinflation in their currency. GDP is plummeting. The people are restive and eager to revolt. We saw in December 2017 how they flocked to the streets. They're still flocking to the streets. The Iranian regime is on its deathbed right now. I'm not predicting it's going to get toppled anytime soon, but it is very, very, very dire.
Thank you very much. For our next question, I'm going to ask our moderator, Lorraine Simonis. Lorraine, could you please come on and ask your question of our panelists?
Yes, hello, good evening. My name is Lorraine Simonis. I am a 2017 ILAP graduate. It was a really amazing experience, really exposed me to a lot of the challenges, but also opportunities in the region. I earned my law degree from the University of Virginia. Currently, I'm working as an associate at a law firm in my hometown of Philadelphia. And prior to that, I clerked for two federal judges. So my question here is going to be for Team Trump, and I'm maybe showing my cards here a little bit, but you know, when I first registered to vote at 18, I registered as a Republican very proudly. Fast forward 10 years, I did something I never thought I would do. And I changed my registration to Democrat because I've been, disturbed by a lot of the substance and style of what I've been seeing in the Trump administration. So, I think, whatever our differences, we can probably agree that Donald Trump is a polarizing figure in that he elicits, very strongly positive or negative reactions from people. And I think, Dr. Miller, you touched on this a little bit in your opening remarks. Traditionally, support for Israel has been fairly bipartisan. However, it seems that in the past, few years, support for Israel has become more and more strongly associated with the GOP and even sort of with Trump personally. So I guess as a threshold matter, I mean, do you agree that this is happening? If so, do you think it is a problem that this is becoming an increasingly partisan issue? And if it is, what will your preferred ticket do to ensure that support for Israel does remain bipartisan, or to the degree that some of that has been eroded to rebuild some of that bipartisanship? I guess for me, despite changing parties, my support for Israel remains unchanged. But I'm concerned that that's not necessarily going to be the case for others who may be really turned off by the increasing partisanship in our politics.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. I'm going to ask Daniel Elon first to begin with that, and then we'll switch it to the other side.
Okay, well, thank you, Lorraine, for your great support for Israel, and thank you for a very intelligent question. It is true that the bipartisanship today is eroded, but I submit that Trump inherited a situation which was already very polarized and bipartisan, or partisan when it came to Israel. And this was during the 8 years of President Obama, which Biden was the vice president. And I think what we have seen under the President Obama and Biden administration, that the Democratic Party, or at least a big chunk of it, went all the way to, I would say, what they call euphemistically progressive, but basically to a very anti-Israel position. We see that no more do they have Jerusalem on the platform, no more they have support of Israel on the Democratic platform. And this is yielding to those very vociferous, small, luckily still section of those who are anti-Israel within the Democrats. I believe that the Democrats will find their heart and soul quickly, because still the mainstream, including, of course, Biden and Chuck Schumer and the like, will resume the bipartisanship support of Israel without fearing of losing votes in the primaries to all those Bernie Sanders voters. Now, having said that, I would like to ask you to look at the evidence. We should look at style. We shouldn't look at anything but what we are asked. And this is something which is maybe controversial. This is something that only a court may decide. And in a way, you are the jurists, and the jurists should decide on evidence and look at the evidence, where the relations were 4 or 8 or 12 years ago, and where they are today.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ayalon. I want to bring in Aaron David Miller to come back on that question, please. Aaron, could you respond with equal time?
I'll remind you, Danny, of Benjamin's opening comments to us. This is a discussion about what is good for the U.S.-Israeli relationship, a relationship that has thrived for decades, in large part because there was an affinity of interests and values. I'm not going to bring Mr. Netanyahu into this discussion, only to say that he has been Mr. Trump's partner in what I think, even though tensions in the Obama administration were acute, they were nothing, and you know this, they were nothing like tensions that I experienced working for George H.W. Bush and James Baker. And what's happened under Trump, however, has gone well beyond that. Bipartisanship and shared values is the adhesive that holds this relationship together. And Donald Trump has taken an issue which may have been increasingly fraught in terms of divisions between Republicans and Democrats, and taken it to a new level. You cannot accuse Jews in America of disloyalty because, as President Trump declared, they're either unaware or disloyal because they don't understand the danger that the Democratic Party poses to the state of Israel. And I might add, he's not only referring to the squad. I find it extraordinary that it is hard for the two of you to grasp the underlying challenge that now confronts the U.S.-Israeli relationship. It must be bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats must both be convinced that it is in the broadest conception of American national interests to support the state of Israel. And frankly, I think injecting the notion that the GOP is the go-to party, demonizing the Democrats, is going to fracture that very strong adhesive, which is critically important to maintaining the special relationship.
Thank you, Aaron David Miller. We're going to move now to our third moderator, and that is going to be Micah Jones. Micah, if you can ask your question. In order to get through the debate topics that have been selected, I'm going to ask all of our moderators to keep their answers to 60 seconds, to answer directly and artfully, because remember, you have an opportunity to come back and make summary statements in just a few minutes. So with that, I'd like to bring on Micah Jones.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for participating in tonight's debate. It's been a robust discussion thus far. My name is Micah Jones, and I'm a practicing attorney in Boston, Massachusetts. Before law school, I served over 5 years as a Ranger qualified military intelligence branch detail infantry officer in the United States Army. Last summer, I had the opportunity to participate as one of the international delegates in the Miriam Institute's International Law and Policy Tour, where I experienced a truly on-the-ground perspective of Israel, as well as a greater understanding of the U.S.-Israel relationship. I have been a member of the Democratic Party since I could vote. I, however, have recently left the Democratic Party and re-registered as an independent because I believe that the Democratic Party has embraced the most radical elements of its base. And I know you just mentioned some of the elements briefly, but I believe the Democratic Party's failure in condemning the anti-Semitic remarks of Congresswomen Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, and embracing Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's radical policy proposals have forced the Democratic Party to move significantly to the left. My question this evening, stemming from my belief that the Democratic Party's embrace of the radical left has become the stance of the party, the question is for the Biden-Harris team. And I apologize for a kind of a long intro to the question, but I want to provide some information for the audience members who may not be familiar with some of the terms that I use in framing the question. Critical race theory and intersectionality are two theoretical frameworks that have gained significant traction within the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Critical race theory examines society and culture as they relate to categorizations of race, law, and power. Intersectionality focuses on the interconnected and interdependent systems of discrimination and disadvantage associated with the categories of race and gender. Put in simpler terms, both theories focus on who is an oppressor and who is a victim. When the theories are applied in the international context, and particularly to Israel, the Jewish state is viewed within the quote-unquote oppressor category. This oppressor category fits within the context of both theories because Jews are wrongfully categorized as white, and Israel is viewed as a white settler colonial state occupying land formerly inhabited by indigenous people of color. This is the common view of Israel on many American college campuses and is also a belief shared by many progressive American Jews. Students graduating from these campuses with these beliefs will become influencers and policymakers. And members of the far left progressive wing of American Jewry lend an outside influence and permissibility when lending their approval ostensibly from a Jewish. My question is, in a future Biden-Harris administration, how do you anticipate the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the likely cabinet secretaries and administration officials who subscribe to the theoretical frameworks of intersectionality and critical race theory affecting the future U.S.-Israel relationship.
Thank you very much. And that's to you, Chuck Freilich, please, if you'd begin, and then we'll bounce it over to Josh Hammer. And actually, I'm going to take a liberty with the time. I'm going to extend our time by 10 minutes. And you have 90 seconds, Chuck, if you would go.
You're nothing but gracious, Benjamin. I appreciate the extra 30 seconds. And thanks for the question, Micah. I don't think that the progressives are the Democratic Party. They are a wing of the party. And I'm quite concerned. I share your concern about that, absolutely. And Danny is correct that Trump inherited something that began beforehand, something which Prime Minister Netanyahu had a major role in. But President Trump has exacerbated it greatly. And yes, there's the progressive wing. It's a little bit of a fringe, and I hope it doesn't become more than that. There's a parallel on the Republican side of the hard right, which is isolationist and frankly anti-Semitic. I am deeply worried by the drop in support for Israel, which on the Democratic side has been dramatic in the last 2 years. There's no doubt about it. Well, the question is whether we want to make it even worse or we want to improve the situation. Now, let me also point out that recent polls showed what we've always known for decades. 70% of the American Jewish public votes Democratic. So do we really want to continue policies and ways of communicating that further create this divide? Do we want to alienate the half of the American public, give or take, the Democratic Party? Do we want to alienate the Jewish community? Well, of course, the answer is no. It must be bipartisan. And the most important thing that we can do to maintain the long-term relationship is to make a serious effort to reach a breakthrough on the Palestinian issue.
Thank you very much, Chuck Freilich. Josh Hammer, equal time, please.
Sure. So real quick on the previous question, just because I didn't get a word in there. I think it's a popular narrative that Donald Trump has exacerbated the partisanization, if you will, or the partisanship of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Unfortunately, for the people who claim that narrative, it is indisputably belied by Gallup polling on this very issue. In fact, Gallup polling going back to the Bush administration and Obama administration clearly showed that it was actually during the post 9/11 period, during the Bush administration, that the partisan delta, the differential between Americans' views on the U.S.-Israel relationship and on whether Americans sympathize more with the Israelis or the Palestinians soared during the Bush administration when Republicans saw Israel as a better ally in the war on terror. It was, of course, exacerbated during the uniquely anti-Israel Obama administration, which from beginning to end was committed to providing daylight between the U.S. and the Israel relationship. On to the current question, though. Intersectionality and multiculturalism, identity politics, I use these terms synonymously in my written work. All of these terms are completely antithetical to the very concept of America and by extension, Western civilization. America, of course, founded our national motto, E pluribus unum, from many one. Abraham Lincoln's, of course, his famous conclusion, his peroration in the Gettysburg Address, this government of the people, by the people, for the people. It is all dedicated to it's all centered around the Genesis 1:27 notion that we are all made in God's image. That is the underlying meritocratic basis of all of this. Intersectionality, this hierarchy, this ranking of classes, of races, of sexual orientations, of immigration statuses based on privilege, on oppressor status, it never redounds to the interests of Jewish people, ever. And we, of course, see that this far leftist sentiment going back to the 19th century Marxist thought has only percolated into the 21st century. It's just simply adjusted itself from a class-based struggle to a skin color-based struggle. And of course, as Micah points out, we see that in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They are always siding with the Palestinian jihadists against Israel because
Thank you, Josh Hammer. Thank you very much indeed for that. We're going to bring up our final question from our moderator. That's from Jenny Shulkin. Could we hear from Jenny Shulkin, please?
Hi. Can everyone hear me? Great. Well, thanks, Benjamin, for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to ask a question, which I will pose first to Aaron David Miller. My name is Jenny Shulkin, and since my law school graduation, I have worked as both a prosecutor and a criminal defense attorney. I was on the board of the Jewish Law Students Association at Harvard Law School and have led sizable groups of my peers on 2 different trips to Israel. A candidate's position on Israel has always been of critical importance to me when deciding who to vote for. So first, with respect to foreign policy, the Biden campaign has devoted little time and attention to peace in the Middle East, While in contrast, President Trump has made a concerted effort over the past several months to achieve historic victories for Israel, such as normalizing diplomatic relations between Israel and the UAE, Israel and Bahrain, and now Israel and Sudan. Domestically, on the other hand, Vice President Biden has launched a campaign centered around national unity and equality, while President Trump has been slow to outright condemn white supremacy, and anti-Semitic hate crimes, as well as other types of hate crimes, have spiked under his leadership. Many believe that President Trump's words and actions have emboldened racist and anti-Semitic supporters throughout the country, which in the long run may negatively affect the status of both American Jews and America's relationship with Israel. So my question is, how do you weigh the candidates' outspoken commitments to Israel and its success versus their track records with respect to divisiveness and prejudice, which of course have potential implications for the relationship between our two countries?
Thank you very much, Jenny. Aaron David Miller, if you could take that question, please.
Let me make two comments. Joe Biden's history is a history of bridge building. In fact, he's been attacked by progressive elements within his own party for relationships he struck over the years with Southern senators. And I think, frankly, given the fact that this republic confronts, by my count, at least 5 crises, all interrelated to one another, that Biden's priorities will be national recovery. Biden faces probably the greatest challenge of national recovery of any president since Franklin Roosevelt, without the benefit to Roosevelt of a world war that left America stronger at home and with more influence abroad. The United States today is weaker at home with less influence abroad, largely as a consequence, I would argue, of Trump's incompetence and fecklessness. I do not believe, frankly, for either Trump nor Biden, whoever is reelected. I mean, if Trump is reelected or Biden becomes president, foreign policy is going to keep. It is an inside the Beltway issue, which is of little concern, frankly, to most Americans who at the moment are fighting and struggling, consumed with worries about their own health, the health of their family, and the economy. I suspect both Trump and Biden would continue to punch pro-Israeli positions. I don't think Biden is going to have the bandwidth to take on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which frankly, at the moment, is increasingly fraught and without a solution.
Thank you, Aaron David Miller. Ambassador Danny Ayalon, could you please come back on that question?
Sure. Again, with your permission, I will just stick to the facts of the evidence, which is clear for everyone. Just about a week ago, ACC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, refused to attend a memorial service for Rabin. Now, this is not Benjamin Netanyahu. This is Yitzhak Rabin with its legacy and its consensus in Israeli society. This, I can understand that she is incorrigible, but I didn't hear any condemnation, any rebuke, neither from Harris nor from Biden. And I think this speaks volume. If I go a little bit back a few months ago, when Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders threatened to take off or stop military aid to Israel, I did not hear any rebuke from Biden or Harris. And again, this speaks volume. So I am very, very sorry to say, I really appreciate the Democratic Party, and I would very much like it to regain its mainstream and its traditional historical soul and policies. But so far as major Democratic Party leaders, including Chuck Schumer and others, are afraid to go against Ilhan Omar or Miss Presley from Boston or Rashida Tlaib, this is again a very detrimental thing for the relationship.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Danny Ayalon. We're going to now move on to concluding statements. We have heard from our moderators. Each of you has had an opportunity, or your panels have had an opportunity to respond to those, and you've done so with a great deal of information at the base of those responses. I'm going to let our audience know how we're going to proceed. We're going to have 2 minutes summaries from each of the panelists. Those will be, unsurprisingly, strictly timed. And I'm going to actually go according to the order in which we started. The first is Ambassador Danny Ayalon, former ambassador of the States of Israel to the United States of America. Could you please make your 2-minute summary statement?
So again, it's been really, I would say, very much inspiring to have this debate. And again, I ask our viewers as jurors to look at the facts. If we go to Iran, 2009, under Biden and Obama, this was a golden opportunity to change the regime and to support the students who came by millions out in the streets. Obama and Biden looked the other way, saying that this was an internal issue of Iran that sucked all the energy from the poor kids in Tehran, actually strengthening the Ayatollahs. In a sharp contrast, when Mubarak, which is an ally of the United States and Israel, when he faced demonstrations, of course, the Americans did intervene and say he has to go, bringing the Islamist Morsi, and only because of Sisi taking over, we still have Egypt on our side. So on Iran, it's very, very clear who is better for the relationship. The United States is coming back to the Middle East by these peace agreements with the Arab countries, that they are also welcoming U.S. presence here. It's United States is back here in a big way and blocking China or Russia from coming in. This is also great for the relationship, because a strong Israel, a strong America is great for the relationship. When it comes to the Palestinians, the Trump administration was the only one that really took into consideration in a real way Israel's security needs by having a defensible borders and having Israel as a Jewish state.
Thank you, Ambassador Ayalon. That's a strong concluding statement, and I'm delighted to now lob the ball over to Aaron David Miller.
I guess I'm speaking first and foremost as an American, and I would remind the audience that we were charged with trying to evaluate what is good and reciprocal for both the United States and the state of Israel. Look, this relationship does not exist in a vacuum. It's tethered to certain forces that are critically important for its survival. I would argue that Donald Trump has not taken those forces seriously. And in my judgment, watching the U.S.-Israeli relationship over decades, he has undermined and exacerbated tensions, which will increasingly cause further separation of the shared values and interests that bind the relationship. The relationship depends on a political consensus between both parties. It cannot survive with one party claiming it is the go-to party and trying to use that as a political football in order to cater to evangelicals, conservative Republicans, and conservative Jews. It depends on a strong America that's functional, with influence abroad and comedy at home, and sets an example of what, in essence, is good governance for a democracy. And that obviously it pertains to Mr. Netanyahu, his governance practices as well. And it depends on an active pro-Israeli community and a Jewish community that feels secure and not threatened. I would just say again, the U.S.-Israeli relationship is a precious commodity. It's too important to be left, in my judgment, in the hands of a man who has used it largely as a vehicle to advance his own political interests, and whose courting of white nationalists and white supremacists threatens not only American and Jewish values, but the security of Americans and American Jews as well.
Thank you so very much, Aaron David Miller. We now turn to Josh Hammer, syndicated columnist and opinion editor at Newsweek. Josh, you have 2 minutes for a concluding statement.
Thank you, Benjamin. It seems to me that the choice before the audience tonight is an exceedingly stark one. On the one hand, you have Donald J. Trump, the most emphatically pro-Israel, philo-Semitic president of the post-1948 era, arguably in 150, 200 years. He has an Orthodox Jewish daughter. He has Jewish grandchildren. On the other hand of the equation, you have the man who was the vice president during the uniquely hostile anti-Israel Obama administration, the administration that sought to put quote unquote daylight between the U.S. and Israel, the administration that flew pallets of unmarked cash overnight on the U.S. taxpayer dime to fund the world's #1 state sponsor of fundamentalist jihadism, the administration that on the way out as a goodbye kiss in December 2016 passed through the United, or failed to veto, I should say, at the United Nations UN Security Resolution 2234, which called the old city of Jerusalem, the Western Wall itself, the second holiest site in all of Judaism, quote, occupied Israeli territory. We're talking about a man who, way before he was vice president to Barack Obama, in 1982, his threat to take military aid away from Israel prompted Menachem Begin's famous comments about how he is not a Jew on trembling knees. We are talking about a Biden-Harris administration that, if it is put into office, would embolden, would lend a hand to the on-campus radicals, Jewish Justice in Palestine, Jewish Voices for Peace, the people who are shouting down Jews, who are harassing Jews, who are the future leaders who are seeking to diminish, to get the U.S.-Israel relationship out of our foreign policy portfolio. And contrast that to what Donald Trump has done. He has gotten 3 peace deals, the first 3 peace deals between Israel and Arab countries since the 1990s. We have the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan forming an increasingly tough, bold, anti-Iran, anti-Turkey alliance that is not just good for Israel, but is beneficial for United States national security. He has done so by busting neoliberalism, busting multilateralism, and empowering like-minded, morally aligned nations. It is good for Israel. It is good for the U.S. We need 4 more years to see what can possibly happen.
Thank you very much indeed, Josh. A wonderful summary statement. And to match that, I'm very pleased to call Professor Chuck Freilich to put his final argument to the audience. Former Deputy National Security Advisor in the States of Israel, Professor at Columbia University in Manhattan, New York, and very importantly, Professor at Tel Aviv University. Chuck, the floor is yours. You have 2 minutes.
Well, first of all, I would just like for Donnie's edification to read a quote about Biden and the idea of conditioning aid to Israel on the Palestinian issue. I quote, this is from October 31st, 2019. The idea that we would draw military assistance from Israel on the condition that it changes a specific policy, I find that to be absolutely outrageous. I would not condition it. It's a gigantic mistake. The second term, I am afraid, if there is a second Trump term, there will be lots of daylight. Now, sometimes actually daylight is a good thing. And on the 2 main issues, I think Mr. Trump, if he's reelected, there will be lots of daylight. He is going to want, his primary objective is going to be the Nobel. He's expressed his interest in doing it. And that may lead him to a deal with Iran, which will be on conditions that most of, let's say, American experts and certainly people in Israel who are closely familiar with the issue would not want. There is a danger that he will sell out. And the nuclear issue is the issue we face one of the 2 issues we face for the next few years. The second one is the Palestinian issue. Now, yes, Trump certainly deserves credit for the agreements with the various Arab states. We were never at war with them. It's very important, but we weren't at war with them. They're far away. We have to live with the Palestinians. I said before, the ratio today is 60-40. We are becoming a binational state. If anybody wants to understand what a binational state is, I suggest you look at the recent history of Iraq and Syria. That's what we could have down the line. Now, let me read to you what a few of the president's closest advisors think of him.
Chuck Freilich, I'm sorry that is the end of your time. I want to thank everybody for taking part in this debate. It's really been wonderful. I have learned a tremendous amount from all of the panelists, and I also have learned a tremendous amount about what is on the minds of the American voter by way of our moderators' questions. Thank you very much, and that concludes our program.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.